So I'm going to launch right into it. I like this story as well. This is the story of Noah and the flood, and then the Tower of Babel, which I think are juxtaposed very interestingly. The Tower of Babel is one of those stories like Cain and Abel that's only a few lines long. It's like a fragment in some sense, although the story of Noah is quite a well-developed narrative. But like the other stories that we've covered, it is relevant at multiple levels of analysis simultaneously. And so what I'm going to do to begin with is to start with some background information, so some psychological background information so that the story makes sense. And the first thing that I'd like to make a case for is that you bring to bear on the world an a priori perceptual structure, and that's really an embodied structure, and it's a consequence of the 3.5 billion years that you've spent putting your body together, which is a tremendous amount of time. And not only your body, but your mind, of course, because your mind is part of your body and very much embedded within it. You know, you tend to think that you have your brain in your head and it's sort of floating separate from the rest of your body, but it's not really true. You're a tremendous, massive system of neurons running through your entire body, autonomic. There's more neurons in the autonomic nervous system than there are in the central nervous system, so that's a lot of neurons. And then your central nervous system, of course, enables you to exercise voluntary control over your musculature and also to receive information from it. Your brain is really distributed through your body. One of the things you may not know is that people who are paraplegic can walk. If you suspend them above a treadmill, their legs will walk by themselves with no voluntary control. So your spine is capable of quite complex activity. In fact, when you walk, mostly it's a controlled fall, and mostly your spine is doing it. And so anyways, the point of all that is that you don't have a blank slate consciousness that's interpreting a world that manifests itself as segregated objects in some straightforward sense. You have a built-in interpretive system that's extraordinarily deeply embedded and invisible, because you might think about it as the implicit structure of your unconscious. It's what gives rise to your conscious experience, and it presents you with the world. That's one way of thinking about it, and it's a good way of thinking about it. It's a psychoanalytic way of thinking about it, as well as the neuroscientific way of thinking about it, because one of the things that's pretty interesting about modern neuroscientists, especially the top-rate ones, and those are usually the ones that are working on emotions, as far as I've been able to tell, are often quite enamored of the psychoanalysts. Jaak Panksepp was a good example of that, because they came to understand that the psychoanalysts' insistence on underlying unconscious personified motivations was actually an accurate reflection of how the brain worked. So to think of yourself as a loose collection of autonomous spirits that's governed by some overarching identity is a reasonable way of thinking about it. The question is, or a question that arises from that is, what is the nature of this a priori structure that you use to interpret the world? And I think the clearest answer to that is that it's a story, and you live inside the story. And that's very, very interesting to me, because I believe, and I have a couple of videos that lay this out, I believe that Darwinian presuppositions are at least as fundamental as Newtonian presuppositions. I actually think they're more fundamental, and that the fact that we've evolved story-like structures through which to interpret the world indicates to me that there's something deeply true about story-like structures. They're true at least insofar as the fact that we've developed them means that here we are living, and that it's taken 3.5 billion years to develop them. They're highly functional. And so we don't have much better definition of truth than highly functional. You know, that's about as good as it gets, partly because we're limited creatures and we don't have omniscient knowledge, and so the best we can do with our knowledge, generally speaking, is to note its functionality and improve it when it fails to work properly. I think the scientific method actually does that. And so the fact that we've evolved a story-like structure through which to interpret the world, that's pretty damn interesting. It says something fundamental about stories, and it's strange in the same way that the fact that we have hemispheric specialization for the known and the unknown, or for chaos and order and chaos, respectively, also says something fundamental about the nature of the world. If you assume that, we've evolved to reflect the structure of the world, broadly speaking, and that's obviously not just the physical structure, the atoms and the molecules, but all of the patterned manifestations of the physical molecules as they build structures of increasing complexity across time. That would include human interactions and and political interactions, economic interactions, familial interactions, all of those things that are a very important part of our reality, perhaps in some sense not as fundamental as the physical attributes that the physicists concentrate on. So we live in stories. And so I want to talk to you a little bit about stories and about their structure, because when you understand a little bit about the structure of stories, then a whole array of things about mythology all of a sudden make overwhelming sense. And it's so useful, because what you see is that many of the things that are standard occurrences in your life, everyone's life, that are portrayed universally in mythology, and it's very helpful because, first of all, it de-isolates you. One of the things you learn as a clinical psychologist, contra the anti-psychiatrists, let's say, is that diagnosis is often a relief to people. There's a problem with being diagnosed, because then you might be labeled, and then the label can follow you for the rest of your life. And once you're labeled as something, then strange things happen around you that often reinforce that label. Maybe you start acting it out more, or you adopt it as an identity. But there's a flip side of that, which is that the last thing that you ever want to hear when you go see a physician or a psychologist is, I've never seen a case like yours before. Right, that is not a relief, man, because if the message is, I've never heard anything like what you're telling me, the outcome is either going to be not so good for you, or you're not going to get listened to at all, right? Because you're such an anomaly that your existence is annoying to the integrated knowledge structure of the medical professional that you're attempting to receive advice from. Well, it's definitely the case, because, if you can be put in a box, then the box tells the doctor what to do with you, and that's actually a relief to the doctor, but also a relief to you, right? Because you want to know. So you come and you say, look, I can't go out of my house much anymore. I'm afraid on elevators. I have heart palpitations, and sometimes I end up in the emergency room. Increasingly, my interactions in the world are restricted. I find myself staying at home. I'm afraid I'm going to die of a heart attack. And the psychologist says, well, you have agoraphobia. It's like lots of people have that, and here's usually how it develops, and here's the treatment course, and we can probably do something about that. And it's like, well, you're not going to die of a heart attack now, probably. That's a real relief. You're not crazy in a completely unique way, and you're crazy in a way that might be treatable, and it's such a relief, because people come in there with a pile of snakes of indeterminate magnitude, and they walk out with one manageable snake, and it's still a snake, but one manageable snake beats a hydra, right? So, all right, so back to stories. So the stories that we tell and that we live in are fundamentally ways that we deal with the complexity of the world. And the fundamental problem with the world, as far as I can tell, is that not only is it complex beyond your comprehension, but the complexity shifts in unpredictable ways. So that's the Darwinian conundrum, actually. That's why Darwinism seems to be a practical necessity with regards to the continuation of life, because the complexity changes unpredictably, you can't necessarily tell what's going to work in the future. And so the Darwinian process solves that by generating quasi-random variations and letting whichever one by happenstance happens to work in that environment survive. Now, it's not random precisely, because the underlying structure is conserved. It's very rare that a child would be born with an extra arm or something like that. And like the skeletal structure that you inhabit is shared by animals going way, way back in evolutionary history. There's a lot of conservation in the evolutionary process, but so there's variation within conservation, like music. It's a good way of thinking about it. So the stories that we tell have exactly the same structure. They have this core element with variations. And so, all right, I'll turn to the stories. And so the first problem, as I mentioned, is a complexity problem. Things are just too complicated to get a handle on. And that actually has serious consequences, because what happens to everyone eventually is that their lives become so complicated that they die. So, and many terrible things can happen to you on the way to dying as well that are complexity related, right? You can develop a serious illness that you can't get a handle on. You can hit what would you call an impasse in your relationship that you cannot get past and see no way out of. That happens to people quite frequently. People who are suicidal, for example, they often feel like they've been backed into a corner, that they have no options. They have no good options. No matter which way they turn, there's something terrible to face, and they can't see any way out of it. And sometimes that's more true than you'd like to think, because we also tend to like to think that people's problems are primarily psychological, but they're not. That's one thing you learn quite rapidly as a clinician, is that most of the time people don't come to you because they have mental illness. They come to you because they have a complexity management problem. Their lives have got out of hand on them, and they don't know how to get them back under control. And so all sorts of things can do that. And then, of course, that can make you anxious or depressed. It can trigger all sorts of illnesses. But the fundamental problem is still that things have got beyond you. And that actually has a psychophysiological cost that isn't merely psychological. You have a limited amount of capacity from a resource perspective to deal with emergent complexity. There's just not enough of you. You'll exhaust your psychophysiological resources if you get into a situation that's too complex. Well, that's what the idea of chaos represents. It represents that underlying complexity that can manifest itself at any time. And it can manifest itself, for example, if you wake up in the morning and you feel an ache of some sort, and perhaps it's nothing, and you ignore it, but it gets worse, and you end up going to the hospital, and you find out, perhaps, for example, that you have pancreatic cancer, and you're going to live for 6 months, and that's the end of that. And so it's at that moment that you break through the thin ice that everyone walks on, and you see what's underneath, and what's underneath is the ineradicable complexity of life, and that's chaos. And now, it's taken people a long, long time to get a grip on this conceptual, what would you call it, conceptual schema. And human beings have done it mostly with image and story before they've been able to do it in any articulated manner. And so there are a set of images that represent this underlying chaos. And one of them is the dragon of chaos, precisely that. And that's the dragon that the hero goes out to confront. That's the symbol of the unknown. It's the thing that lurks underneath. It's the thing that also guards treasure, because in the unknown there's possibility. Also the water that was there, that we talked about in the Mesopotamian creation myth, the water that's there at the beginning, both the salt and the fresh water, is often a symbol of pre-cosmogonic chaos. Often people have dreams, for example. Some of you have had this dream, I suspect. You'll dream that you're in a house that you know well, and all of a sudden you discover a new room, or a set of new rooms, or maybe a set of rooms in the basement. And often the rooms are not well organized, and they're full of water. Those are very common things. And what that means is that you've broken through the constraints of your conscious self-understanding to a new domain of possibility, but a new domain that needs a tremendous amount of work. It says, well, here's a new part of you, but it's not well developed. It's flooded. It's flooded with chaos, essentially. And it's water, I think, partly because chaos is not only what you fall into when you're not expecting it, but it's also the unknown that you confront forthrightly and generate new things out of. And water is a symbol of life, especially in the desert. Of course, life is dependent on water. And so water is a natural symbol to utilize when you're talking about something that's life-giving but also potentially deadly. Because a little bit of water, well, that's a drink, but a lot of water, that's a shipwreck, right? And so, and those are the extremes. Now, there are accounts that are sort of subtexts in Genesis and elsewhere in the Old Testament of God conquering a great monster, Leviathan, or Behemoth that has these sort of serpentine elements, and making the world as a consequence of that conflict. So there's this idea that the world-creating force, which we've talked about as the Logos, is the thing that continually confronts chaos, and that one way of thinking about chaos is as a predatory reptilian monster, and often one that lives in the depths or perhaps underwater. And part of that, I think, is because we actually use our predator detection circuit to do this sort of precognitive processing. And so the notion fundamentally is anything that threatens you instantaneously is something that your predator detection circuit should be working with. It's fast. It's fast. It's low resolution. It doesn't have a lot of ideas, but it's really, really fast. And that also accounts for our capability and tendency to very rapidly treat people who upset our conceptual structures as enemies of the predatory variety. We can fall into that in no time flat. It's the archetype. If something comes along to knock you for a loop, it's a shark. It's something that lurks under the water. It's something that'll pull you down. It's an enemy. And you should get prepared. And that's a reasonable defensive strategy, even though it also has its dangers and can sometimes be wrong. So the landscape within which we have to erect our stories is fundamentally one of an overarching chaos, a chaos that exceeds our capacity to comprehend in any sense, individually, familial, socially, economically. We're always threatened by the collapse of the structures that we inhabit constantly. We have to work. Well, it's like you own a house, you know. How much time do you spend maintaining a house? Well, a lot. And why is that? Is because the house falls apart because you're stupid, and the house falls apart, well, because you do repairs wrong or you ignore things, right? And I'm saying this actually for technical reasons. The house falls apart because you're incompetent. But even if you're competent, the house falls apart, right? It's just entropy, and so things have a proclivity to fall apart on their own, so you just have to run like mad just to keep them doing what they're supposed to be doing. And then, of course, that is complicated by your own willful blindness and inadequacy as a repair person and refusal to attend and all those other things. So and that's a very classic idea, which we'll return to. One of the ideas that Mircea Eliade, famous historian of religions, extracted from a very large corpus of flood myths was the idea that the earth is periodically flooded for two reasons. One is things fall apart. Just entropy, straight entropy. I don't remember which law of thermodynamics that is, but it's one of the big laws of thermodynamics. It's one of the top three, man. Things fall apart of their own accord. And that's one of the things that we have to contend with. And then the rate at which things fall apart is sped by the sins of men. That's the other idea. And you know that. Everyone knows that because you know, your car breaks down on the highway. You think, God, that's so inconvenient. And then you shake your fist at the sky, and then there's part of you in the back of your mind that goes, God, I knew that rattle that I wasn't paying attention to actually signified something, and I knew I should have paid attention to it, and I didn't, and now I'm in the situation that I'm in now. And I bet you this happens to people 2 or 3 times a week, is they do something stupid that they know they shouldn't have done, that they told themselves not to do mere seconds before, and they know the voice says, don't do that. Yeah, you do it. You can get nailed for it exactly the way that you knew you would get nailed for it, and then you're hurt doubly because not only did it fall apart, but you're the idiot that made it fall apart, knowing full well that it was going to fall apart and ignoring it. And so that's the idea behind the notion that there are 2 reasons that things fall apart: thermodynamic entropy and the proclivity of people not to attend to things they know they should attend to. And partly we do that because if a problem emerges, it always announces itself, unless it's a really, really tiny problem and you're approaching it voluntarily, it always announces itself with negative emotion. And that's part of the predator detection circuit. It announces itself in frustration or disappointment or emotional pain or grief or the paramount one, anxiety. And no wonder, because it's a problem, right? And one of the logical responses is to sort of freeze in the face of the problem. But of course, if it's a problem that has to be addressed and solved, freezing it and turning away from it is not a good solution, because since things tend to fall apart on their own accord, if you just leave the thing alone that's problematic, it's just going to get worse, not better, which is one of the things that's very annoying about life. So, for example, if you get a warning message from the tax department, the probability that ignoring that will make it go away is 0, right? What will happen instead is that the more you ignore it, the larger it will grow. And if you ignore it long enough, then it will turn into something large enough to eat you. And that will be the end of you. And I read in Harper's Magazine at one point that people would rather be mugged than audited. And so I believe that, because the mugging, man, that's over, right? It's like a couple of minutes of sheer terror, loss of your wallet, away you walk. The audit, that's like a semi-fatal disease. So that's chaos. Now, it's the idea here, too, is that that's the chaos. That's the psychological idea, is that that's also the chaos that whatever is being represented in Genesis as the Spirit of God extracts order out of at the beginning of time. And it's also that which we're constantly contending with as we struggle in the same manner to construct and maintain habitable worlds. So it's brilliant. It's brilliant. When I first put together the relationship between what Iliad called the pre-cosmogonic chaos and the predatory landscape that surrounded our ancestors and the manner in which we're structured neurologically to respond to all of that, I thought it was like an amazing epiphany, because it's self-evidently the case that the world is too complicated for us to deal with, and that's one of the problems that we face on an ongoing basis. And then the question is, well, what do you do about that? And if you ignore it, it gets worse, so ignoring it doesn't work, and so we know what doesn't work, and so if ignoring it doesn't work, then attending to it might work. And then I found out with the Egyptians, for example, that Horus was the god of attention, and the same thing happened among the Mesopotamians with Marduk and his ring of eyes. It's like, what's the way to forestall the catastrophe of things falling apart? And the answer to that is by attending to them, voluntarily attending to them. And that slots very nicely into the hero mythology that promotes the idea that if there's a dragon in the whereabouts, in the neighborhood, let's say, that hiding in the basement just makes it grow larger. It's time to go out and confront the damn thing. And the general stories well, you might get killed because it's a dragon, but it's only might, as opposed to definitely will get killed if it happens to attack you at 3 a.m. at home when you're hungover and it's been a bad day and you don't have your sword and your shield at the ready, which is generally what happens to people who avoid things. So it's not something that should be recommended. You're screwed both ways. That's one of the things that's so nice about being deeply pessimistic. It's so freeing, because one of the things, well, it's very frequent. It's such a relief. And it's really a useful habit to develop, is sometimes, no matter what you do, you're in trouble. And that's a relief, because then you can stop scrabbling around for the way out. There's no way out, man. It's like you can pick murder, wretched death A or slightly less wretched death B, something like that. And I know that's a terrible way of looking at things, but it is extraordinarily useful to understand that many times your choice boils down to picking the least bad option. And if that's all you can do, if that's how life is revealing itself to you, it's like, well, more power to you. The least bad option, that's the best you can do. And it's good enough, especially compared to the alternative, which is the most bad option. So, all right, now, so the fundamental reality of things is complexity beyond comprehension. And then the question is, well, how is it that you manage that? And partly you manage that, and this is where the image of the patriarchal order comes in the positive manner, I might point out, because in the absence of patriarchal structure, for lack of a better lexicon, there's nothing but chaos. And I wouldn't recommend chaos because there's a lot of it, and there isn't that much of you. And if you think you can handle it without an a priori structure and without a sociological structure surrounding you, then you don't know anything at all about human beings. Because one of the things I've noticed, for example, is that it's unbelievable the degree to which our sanity depends on a functioning sociological structure. And here's why. Well, first of all, you kind of need to know what to do every day. You have to have a routine, because you're an animal, and if you have a dog or a cat, dogs are a really good example of this. Dogs like routine. They like to be walked the number of times a day that they're supposed to be walked, and they get quite sick very rapidly if you don't routinize their days. Children are exactly the same way. Now, you can overdo it, right? But still, you need to know approximately when you should get up. It should be approximately the same every day. You need to know approximately when you're going to eat. You need to know what you're going to eat. You need to know who you're going to eat with. You need to know where to buy your food. It's like 80% of your life, 70% of your life, something like that, consists of those things that you do every single day, that you repeat. And those are often the things that people think about as the trivial elements of their life. But one of the things I would like to point out to you, if you do the mathematics, I did this with a client of mine who was having a hard time putting his child to bed. They were having a fight every night. And I knew by that time, the studies indicate that most parents only spend 20 minutes per day of one-on-one time with their child. Now, the reason for that is that people are busy, and it's actually not that easy to parse out 20 minutes of one-on-one time. It's a lot bloody more time than you think. But that's all there is, 20 minutes. And he's spending like 40 minutes a day fighting with this kid, trying to get the kid to go to bed. And that's not very entertaining. You think, well, it's just having a scrap with the kid about going to bed. But it's no. If it happens every day, it's a catastrophe. So you do the math. So we'll say 5 hours a week for the sake of argument, just to keep it simple. It's 20 hours a month. It's 240 hours a year. That's 6 40-hour work weeks. That guy was basically spending a month and a half of work weeks doing absolutely nothing but having a wretched time fighting with his son, trying to get him to go to bed. Horrible, right? That's just way too much time to spend doing something like that if you want to actually have a positive relationship with someone, because it's just too punishing. And so you need structure, you need predictability, and you need more of it than you think, just to keep you sane. Now, if you're lucky, and maybe a bit odd, you can deviate 5% from the norm, or 10% from the norm, or something like that, carefully and cautiously, as long as the rest of you is all well ordered in a normative manner. You might be able to get away with that, and you might be able to sustain it across time, and people might be able to tolerate you if you do it, or maybe you'll get really lucky and you happen to be creative but reasonably well put together, and people will actually be happy that there's something idiosyncratic and unique about you. But even under those circumstances, mostly what you want is to have a routine that's disciplined, that's predictable, and bloody well stick to it. You're going to be way healthier and happier and saner if you do that. And then the other thing that you need, because this is one of the things the psychoanalysts got wrong, I think, is that they overestimated the degree to which sanity was a consequence of being properly structured internally, Because from the psychoanalytic point of view, you're sort of an ego, and that ego is inside you. Of course, it rests on an unconscious structure, but the purpose of psychoanalysis is to sort out that unconscious structure and the ego on top of it, and to make you a fully functioning and autonomous individual. But there's a problem with that, because the reason that you're sane as a fully functional and autonomous human being isn't because you've organized your psyche, even though that's important. The reason that you're sane, if you have a well-organized unconscious and ego, is because other people can tolerate having you around for reasonably extensive periods of time, and will cuff you across the back of the head every time you do something so stupid that people will dislike you permanently if you continue. And so what people are doing to each other all the time, just non-stop, is broadcasting sanity signals back and forth, right? It's like you smile at people if they're not only behaving properly, but behaving in a way that you would like to see them continue to behave. You frown at them if they're not, you ignore them if they're not, you shun them, you roll your eyes at them, you manifest a disgust face, you don't listen to them, you interrupt them, you won't cooperate with them, you won't compete with them. It's like you're blasting signals at other people about how to regulate their behavior so frequently, well, it just makes up all of your social interaction. That's why we face each other, and we have emotional displays on our face, and we're looking at each other's eyes, and we know as much as we can about what's going on with each other, given that we don't have immediate access to the contents of their consciousness. And so partly what you're doing with your routine is establishing yourself as a credible, reliable, trustworthy, potentially interesting human being who isn't going to do anything too erratic at any moment. And everyone else is around there tapping you into shape, making sure that that's exactly what you are. And that's how you stay sane. And so what happens to people too, if they don't have a routine and they get isolated, is they start to drift. And they drift badly because the world is too complicated for you to keep it organized all by yourself. You just cannot do it. So we outsource the problem of sanity. And it's very intelligent that we outsource the problem of sanity, because sanity is an impossibly complex problem. And so the way that we manage the incredibly complex problem is we have a very large number of brains working simultaneously on the problem all the time. It's like a stock market for sanity. And it's partly, and I use that definition with purpose, because the stock market does the same kind of impossible thing, right? Because it tries to price things, which is impossible. How many things are there? Like 1 billion. How in the world do you decide what the price is? You can't decide what the price is. That's why you have a stock market. Well, in a free market, I mean for consumer goods, is everyone's voting on what the price of everything is all the time. And that's the way we figure it out, because it's technically impossible. That's partly why the stock market explodes now and then, and there's bubbles and all that sort of thing. But anyways, the point is, things are chaotic. In Alice in Wonderland, when Alice goes down the rabbit hole, that's the underworld, right? So now she's gone into the substructure of being. And she meets the Red Queen. And the Red Queen is Mother Nature. And Mother Nature is running around yelling, "Off with their heads, off with their heads," which is, of course, what Mother Nature does. And she tells Alice, "In my kingdom, you have to run as fast as you can just to stay in the same place." And that's exactly right. And that's a description of, in fact, evolutionary biologists and psychologists have picked up on that phrase. They call it the Red Queen problem. And the Red Queen problem is everything's after you all the time, and you're not smart enough to do anything about it, or enough about it. And so that's a permanent existential problem. So how do you deal with that? You've got a biological structure. So your embodiment is part of the solution to the problem. And then you're enculturated. And because you're enculturated, you're taught a lot of things that you need to know, but mostly what you're taught is how to communicate with other people in an acceptable manner. And then once you can communicate with people in an acceptable manner, then you can outsource your problems constantly, which you're doing constantly. And so we're in this continual dynamic exchange of problem solving. So if you're a socialized person, that's what you get access to. And that's something to know if you're going to have kids. And I mentioned this, I think, in a previous lecture. The purpose of being a parent for very young children is to make your children exceptionally socially desirable by the age of 4. Because if you can do that, they're set. Because everyone wants them around. And as soon as everybody wants them around, they want to play with them, they want to cooperate with them, they want to compete with them. It's like the door's open, and they stay sane because they've got all sorts of people who actually like them, that are helping them out. And so that's your goal, is to make them as socially acceptable as you possibly can, socially desirable as you possibly can. And that doesn't mean you render them obedient without spirit, right? That's a tyrant's mode of enforcing social acceptability. It's like, never do anything wrong. Well, that's not any way to, that's a good piece of advice, but it's missing the other half, which is do a bunch of things that are right so that people are thrilled to have you around. And encourage that. That's what you want to do as a parent, as well as inculcating the order. And so, and in this little diagram, I indicated that there's God the Father with the Son behind him, and he's ruling over this walled city. So he's like the meta spirit of the walled city. It's very, very nice image, brilliant image. So it's the collective spirit of the city. That's another way of thinking about it, or the collective spirit of the city across time, or the collective spirit of the force that built and maintained the city across time. Even better, and that's associated with the sun, because it's associated with enlightenment and illumination, and all of those things that we associate with higher consciousness and vision. It's a brilliant image. And then I overlaid this, Now, of course, the patriarchal aspect of existence can become tyrannical. It does that quite regularly. It's one of the existential dangers of human civilization. It's that civilization is a medication for chaos, but it can spin out of control in and of itself and become its own sort of problem, which is like a hyper-order problem generally, which then produces a chaos problem. So every solution carries within it certain problems, right? Because no solution is perfect, and so you have to keep things in balance. But it's one of the reasons that I'm really let's call it irritated about the postmodernists, because they keep yammering about the patriarchy. And it's very, very annoying because it's self-evident that social structures are tyrannical. It's like, that's not news, folks. That's obvious. But that's not all they are. And it's the reduction of the entire complex solution, let's say, to a unidimensional problem. It's just tyranny. It's like, no, actually, it's not just tyranny. If you spent 6 months somewhere that was just tyranny, you'd know the difference very, very rapidly. And that doesn't mean that everyone doesn't give up a pound or 2 or 10 or 20 of flesh to participate even in a society that's as free as a Western society is. We all get crushed and molded by the tyrannical force of social convention. But at least in principle, the benefit is worth the cost. And then it's also up to you to make sure that you don't sacrifice more to the group than you should. And you can start to tell if you're sacrificing more to the group than you should, because you start to become resentful of other people. That's part of it. That's part of the psychological mechanism that's informing you of that. So it's up to you to fight against the overarching pressure for conformity, to retain your individual logos, let's say. But that's sort of your problem. It's like the group wants you to behave. Now, if you could behave and be creatively productive, so much the better, but that's pretty damn rare. So the group generally tends to settle just for behave. And there's a tyrannical element of that, but what the hell's the alternative? It's, our society is based on consensus, and the consensus is based on the sacrifice of a certain sacrifice of individuality, even though individuality is absolutely necessary as a revitalizing force for the society. It's a very tough thing to manage properly. So anyways, you have your physiological structure as your first line of ordering in relationship to chaos, because your body presents you with the world in a certain way. And then the second line of defense is something like the sociological structure that you inhabit. We could call those the competency hierarchies or something like that. And thank God for them, because, maybe you're going to be able to specialize in 1 or 2 things in your life, or 5 things, but there's 300 things you need to know. And if it's just you, you'll be doing your genius level mathematics while your bathtub is leaking all over your bathroom floor. And that's not so good, so you can call a plumber, and hooray for that. So, we tend to cooperate to keep chaos under control. And we tend to cooperate to keep order under control. And that's the political dialogue, right? We maintain the culture to keep chaos under control, and we balance the culture out properly to keep the culture under control. And that way we get to live reasonably peacefully, reasonably productively, for a reasonable amount of time. And that's the best that we can do. And we should have some gratitude when that's working, because the default condition of things is that not only do they not work very well, they work worse and worse over time all by themselves. So anytime anything is working, you should just be amazed by it. All right, so what does the frame look like? Well, I think it looks something like this, and this is, as far as I can tell, this is the bare bones of a variety of things. It's a bare bones story. It's a bare-bones conceptual framework. It's a bare-bones Dasein, to speak in Heideggerian terms. It's the bare-bones world that you live in. You're always in one of these worlds. There's no getting out of them. You can move from one to another, but you're always in a world like this. And so this is the world that you're in. You're somewhere, because you have to be somewhere. Now, you might not know where that is, which means that somewhere that you are is chaotic, in which case you need to go over your past in great detail and figure out where you are. It's like you're lost, right? You're lost, and the problem with being lost is when you're lost, you don't know where to go, and the problem with not knowing where to go is there's a million places that you could go, and a million places is too many places for you to go without dying. So being lost is not good. So you need to know where you are. One of the things that we built online, my partners and I, is this program called Past Authoring that helps people lay out the narrative of their past, to identify, to break their life down into 6 stages, epochs we call them, and then to identify the emotionally significant moments in each epoch and to write them out. What happened negatively, what happened positively, what the consequences were, what you derived from it, perhaps what you could have done differently, perhaps what you learned from it, all of that, so that you can narrow in, zero in on determining precisely where it is that you are right now. And people are often loath to do that because they actually don't want to know, because they'd rather be spread out in a sort of half-blind manner in the fog, hoping that the place that they're at is better than it really is, and deluding themselves by remaining vague, than to figure out, I'm right here, right now, with these specific problems. But it's actually better to do that, because if you have a set of specific problems, and you've really narrowed them down and really specified them, then you can probably start fixing them, and you can start fixing them in micro ways, bit by bit. But there's no way you can do that without knowing where you are. It's impossible. And you can kind of tell if you don't know where you are. It's quite straightforward. If you are haunted by reveries of the past, for events that are older than approximately 18 months, if they continue to come up in your mind over and over, in your dreams over and over, you haven't extracted the world out from your past experiences. The potential is still trapped in the past. And to confront the potential means to confront the dragon of the past. And of course, that's terrifying, and it can seriously be terrifying. So for example, maybe you're vague and ill-formed and ill-defined because you were abused very badly when you were a child, 4 years old, something like that. And maybe you were abused by a family member, because that's generally who does the abusing. And so that just makes it worse. And then what that means is that you've got you've had an implicit encounter with malevolent evil. You've had a direct encounter with malevolent evil, but you have an implicit hypothesis of malevolent evil that's plaguing you. It's still there. It's trapped in the memories, right? It's trapped in the representational structure. And as an adult, you're now faced with the necessity of articulating that fully before you have any chance whatsoever of freeing yourself from it. And so that's no joke. Lots of times people have to go into the past. That's what the psychoanalysts do. And say, look, here is something came along and just bloody well knocked me over, and it isn't even that I repressed it, which I think was, well, we won't talk about Freud's errors because Freud was a genius, so we'll just leave him alone. But sometimes it's not repression, it's just that terrible things happen to people at such a young age that there isn't a bloody chance in hell that they can figure out why they happened or what to do with them or what they mean. And then you can carry that with you, and you carry it with you. It's like your body encounters the world in stages, and it happens very rapidly. Well, it can extend over years, but the initial stages happen very rapidly. So, for example, if you're walking down the road and you hear a loud noise behind you, it'll go like this. That's a predator defense response, by the way. You crouch down, and that's to stop something from jumping on your back and getting at your neck too easily. That's like a few hundred milliseconds. It's really fast, or even faster than that. And it better be, because something like a snake, that will say, can nail you just right now, so you better be fast. But it's low resolution. It's like danger snake, something like that, or danger predatory cat. It's that fast. And then you can unravel that and categorize it, but that takes time. You do that with emotion, and then you do it with cognition, and you can do that with long-term thinking, because maybe you've encountered someone specifically malevolent and predatory at work. It happens to people a lot, who's operating as a destructive bully, who seems to have no positive function whatsoever, and is only living that out. And then you don't know what to do about it, so you're in prey mode. I don't mean this kind of mode, although that would help too. But I mean, you're acting like a prey animal, and then you have this terribly complex thing to decompose, which is, what the hell's up with this person? Why are they making my life miserable? What is it about me that allows them to make my life miserable? That's a nasty little road to walk down, and you're stuck with having to decompose it. Maybe you can't. Maybe formulating an explicit philosophy of good and evil to deal with something malevolent in your environment actually just happens to be beyond you. And that could easily be. It's certainly the case for people who are young, and it's the case for plenty of adults as well. It's no simple thing to manage. It's something, too, that often soldiers who have post-traumatic stress disorder have to do, because they've encountered terrible things. They've either done them or ran into them, and they need to update their moral model of the world, or they end up in something closely approximating hell. Anyway, so you need to know where you are. That's this, what is. Where are you? So you're navigating. You're a navigator. You're a sailor on an ocean, man. That's what you are. You're a mobile creature. You're going from point A to point B all the time. You're not sitting there glued to a rock like some brainless, sea creature. There's a funny little creature called a hydra. Very simple little creature. In its juvenile stage, it has a brain because it swims around. But then when it turns into an adult, it latches itself to a rock and promptly digests its brain. Because if you're just sitting on a rock and you're not moving, you don't need a brain. But that's not our issue, right? We're zipping around in the world, and so we're navigating agents. And so to navigate, there's two things you need to know. And the first is, where the hell are you? Exactly, precisely, right? Razor sharp. What's good about you and what's bad about you? By your own reckoning. You don't have to. You can ask other people, but this is a game you play yourself. It's like, as far as I'm concerned, I'm taking stock. What is it that's okay about me and what needs some work? And you got to watch to not be too self-critical when you're doing that too, because that can just be another kind of flaw. And then the next is, okay, well, where are you going? What's your destination? Well, and that's what the frame is. Now, you can do that in a very sophisticated way. And you do that by thinking consciously about who it is that you are in an articulated manner, and where you want to go and why and how you're going to get there. And people hardly ever do that. That's come as such an absolute shock to me as an educator. Because one of the other programs, I use this in my classes. One of the other programs in this suite of programs is called the Future Authoring Program, and I started developing it in my Maps of Meaning class, which is where some of this material is from. And I got students to write about their past. It's like, okay, we're talking about stories, so let's tell your story. Who are you? How do you get here? And what are you now? That usually helps people put things to rest, although it's quite stressful while you're doing it. Stress goes up when you're doing it, and maybe you feel miserable for a couple of weeks, and then stress goes down and it stays down. So that's also why people don't do it, because who the hell wants to have their stress go up? But if it's temporary, it's a sacrifice. So then the next issue is, well, where are you going? And one of the things that, and this I cannot understand. These students that have been in education system for 15 years, 14 years, high-end students, most of them, not once in their whole bloody life did anyone ever get them to sit down for like a day and say, all right, justify your existence. Like, well, seriously, it's like, here you are in university, you're taking a bunch of courses, you've got some sort of vague career plan. It's like, defend the damn thing a bit, since you're going to go live it and everything. You're staking everything on it. It's like, what's your damn plan? And why are you so convinced that it's not the plan of a babbling fool? Because if you haven't thought about it, then it is. And if you really want to go out there and live that out, one of the things Carl Jung said was that you're in a story, whether you know it or not. And then he made two nice comments about that. If it's someone else's story, you're probably going to get a bit part, and it might not be the one you want. And if it's a story that you don't know, it might be one with a really bad ending. Or maybe it's just bad, period, with a worse ending. And if you don't know what the story that you're living out is, maybe that's the one. You know, maybe you got that from your mother, you got it from your grandmother, you got it from your aunt, or God only knows where you picked it up, because you pick up things like mad, because that's what human beings are like. So maybe you're living a malevolent tragedy unconsciously. And then one thing you might ask yourself is, well, how wretched and miserable is your life? Let's add futile to that. How wretched, miserable, and futile is your life? And you might say, well, yeah, 70% on each count. It's like, then you're probably unconsciously living out a malevolent tragedy. And maybe that's not for the best. Well, it's either that or the whole universe hates you, right? Or 70% hates you, you know. So anyways, you know, we got students to start writing in detail about not what they wanted. It's not a career thing. Because that's the closest people usually get, is they have a career plan. It's like, no, it's not a career plan. That's peripheral. Important, but peripheral. It's like, all right, you got 3 years, man. You're going to live them anyways. Devote those 3 years to setting the world up around you so that it's the best it could possibly be for you. As if you were taking care of yourself, as if you cared for yourself. Well, what would that look like? You know, let's say, just for the sake of argument, if you figured out where you were, that you could have what would be best for you. Well, what is that? I bet you never asked. People don't ask. And so life comes at them like random snakes, and they sort of fend them off. And life goes by, and things don't work out the way people expected them to. But a huge part of that is they didn't know where they were, because they wouldn't look, or didn't know that they should look. Ignorance and willful blindness, right? Two great catastrophes.